Welcome to the Quillette podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Kay, a senior editor at Quillette. Quillette is where free thought lives. We are an independent grassroots platform for heterodox ideas and fearless commentary. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to Quillette.com and becoming a paid subscriber. This subscription will also give you access to all our articles and early access to Quillette social events. And this week's guest will be a familiar name to those listeners who've been following Quillette since the late 2010s. Some of you might remember a blockbuster 2019 article entitled "A Victory for Female Athletes Everywhere" by a Duke Law School professor and former US National Collegiate indoor 800-meter champion Doriane Lambelet Coleman. In that article, Coleman made the case for upholding rules that protect the integrity of female athletic categories from the encroachments of trans-identified biological men who assert a female gender identity. Some Quillette readers may also recognize Coleman as the author of a 2021 article whose byline was shared with tennis legend Martina Navratilova, arguing the same principles. Of course, Coleman isn't the only Quillette author and podcast guest we've featured who argues for these points. But she is unusual to such extent that she's not only a former elite athlete, but also a legal scholar at one of America's best law schools. Just the sort of progressive academic bastion where a maximalist expression of trans rights is often presented as non-negotiable. And Coleman has indeed taken her share of abuse online and at public speaking events. But the world has changed since 2019. And Coleman's views are no longer universally dismissed as quote-unquote trans-exclusionary, even in the ivory tower. In large part thanks to the patient advocacy of women such as Coleman, various sporting bodies have come to rediscover the common sense principle that biology matters when it comes to protecting female athletic categories. In a newly published Simon & Schuster book titled On Sex and Gender, Coleman lays out her views on what she regards as the most humane and sensible way to reconcile the demands of trans activists with the scientifically unambiguous fact that elite male athletes are invariably bigger, stronger, and faster than their female counterparts. While she urges traditionalists to make room for trans-identified athletes wherever possible in sports, and society in general for that matter, she also flatly opposes the conceit that biological sex can ever truly be erased, by medical means or otherwise. Please enjoy my conversation about these subjects and more with Doriane Lambelet Coleman. Your book starts with this April 2nd, 2019 appearance. This is before COVID, so you appeared in person at the Judiciary Committee of the United States House of Representatives. And your book appeared just after the 5th anniversary of that appearance. Tell me why you were appearing before that Judiciary Committee.
So I was appearing before the Judiciary Committee to make the case for an exception or a carve-out to the Equality Act's provisions, in particular for separate sex sport. I was called specifically to talk about sports with the view that sports was illustrative, kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of the other ways or other contexts in which sex might still matter, so that we might still need ongoing exceptions to a general non-discrimination rule. And that's what the Equality Act is.
And for those Quillette readers who have long memories, this is a subject you wrote about for Quillette, actually around the time of your 2019 appearance.
Yeah, so I was grateful, by the way, for the opportunity to have appeared in Quillette and to have published that with you. I think you published it in maybe May or April or May.
And I was grateful to see it quoted in the book at some length, so thank you for that.
No, but it was really a wonderful opportunity. I remember you reached out to me and...
Because you were quoted in the New York Times. It was the two were connected because your name appeared on the front page of the print edition of the New York Times that covered.
Right.
And I remember looking at it and I said, oh, wow, Duke Law School. Fancy. I'll give her a call. And this was kind of like early in the debate. I mean, you'd been following the debate for several years, of course, but I think for a lot of readers, it was relatively new. And it was especially a new perspective coming from you because your pedigree as an elite athlete, as an elite runner, who also has looked into the law at the highest level and before and since has been advising international bodies on this. What I thought was particularly interesting about your description of that day you appeared in front of the Judiciary Committee, you linger on the testimony of the legal director of the National Women's Law Center.
Yeah.
And, NWLC, the W stands for women. It's the second word. And yet, if I remember correctly, her testimony to the committee pretty much wanted to erase the carved out protections for women in the sphere. Is that correct?
So the National Women's Law Center, it's one of our, if not our leading nonprofit that has supported women's rights for a really long time. And as I noted in the introduction, my husband was on this board for a while. I mean, it's a really extraordinary organization, and it still does a lot of good work for women. But at one point in the few years before that hearing, it had started to define women to include trans women who had not had any medical interventions, right? Who just identified as women. And now that's a lot more common. We're used to hearing nowadays and understanding that people define the word broadly to include self-identified trans women, no medicalization required. But at the time, it was not the common understanding.
It's still not the common understanding, but in those circles, in elite...
No, I think, no, absolutely, great correction. Thank you. So in the circles that I travel in, even in the circles I travel in, right? That was the first time I had heard, and I was working on this stuff, right? A specific example was a note that trans girls and women have been participating in sports for like 10 years with no problem. And the suggestion was, and so it should not be a problem in an ongoing way. It should be no more a problem now than it was 5 years ago or 6 years ago. The change was that they were now describing trans girls and women as athletes who had not transitioned physically, right? They had declared their transgender status, but they hadn't. And so that's a different person. And when you come from sport like I do, you can care about people and be a good human and respect people for however they identify, but understand that there are different bodies, right? And a body that has experienced female puberty or male puberty is different from a body that hasn't, however we identify. And she was clearly lumping together anyone who is female identifying in terms of their identity or their gender expression, and growing the group in a way that had different implications for sport. So while in sport, we were already wrestling with the question of what amount of transition meds would mitigate the performance
animals per liter of testosterone,
or just how long does it take or whatever. So the organizations were playing with a year or 2 years. How long do you need to be on transition meds? And all of a sudden, you don't have to be on transition.
Snap your fingers and
right. And I wasn't privy before I walked into the hearing room. Right, I wasn't privy to that last move. I just had not heard it before. That's probably my fault. Like I wasn't paying close attention to what was going on.
I think you're blaming the victim here.
No. I had been working in the international sphere almost exclusively and in the international sports space, right? So that's like elite academia or elite circles. Otherwise, the international sports space is also silo, right? And so that's where I had been doing most of my work. So I hadn't been paying attention to sort of politics on the domestic front. And so for me, it was quite a jolt where it might not have been for other people who had been paying attention.
Yeah, well, I would I'd argue that the quote-unquote silo you were in was a silo of biological reality. But throughout this introductory chapter and much of the rest of the book, you strike what I don't know whether to call it an apologetic tone, but you make it pretty clear that you had kind of maybe expected to drift through adult professional life kind of more or less in the sphere that's consistent with progressive activism in general. LGBT rights, feminism, it's well known that academia tends toward progressive causes. And suddenly you found yourself in this weird space where I think it was at the behest of Republicans that you had appeared. And again, I don't know if the word apologetic is right, but you make it clear that it was a disorienting feeling, especially when hyper-conservative media like Breitbart News started calling you for comments like, ugh. Could you describe the sense of disorientation you felt? Because on one hand, you didn't want to be gaslit. Biology is biology. On the other hand, you also didn't want to be like a full-throated defender of all the political baggage or political motivations that maybe were behind people who wanted to push you in front of the cameras, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I probably couldn't say it better than you just did.
Oh, I'm amazing at saying things.
So I definitely like disoriented better than apologetic.
Right.
I mean, the apologetic side is I really care about everybody. I mean, it sounds corny, but I do.
It's clear in the book. You mention exactly how sport helps different constituencies.
I want every human being to be taken care of, especially kids. Like I'm obsessed about kids, right? I've done a lot of my scholarship over the years on child maltreatment, on pediatric medicine, entirely outside of this space, right? And I've raised two phenomenal young men now. And yes, I come from a very liberal background. I've never been an activist myself, but my husband is an advocate for civil rights causes. My father was, I come from a civil rights family. So it's my orientation. It's sort of my zeitgeist, if you will. And so it has been really disorienting to be on the outs with my people. I mean, it sounds kind of corny, but to be on the outs with my people in some way. And I also feel badly to the extent that my beef is really with the strategy of many trans advocates. It's not with trans people, and it's not with rights for trans people. It's with the way certain trans advocates want to get those rights. And I also have a beef with the idea that we should all think of nirvana as a sex blind society. And so to the extent that my beef with the strategy makes some people feel like I don't care about them, that makes me feel bad. You weren't wrong to sense that. The disorienting aspect of it is related, obviously, right? It's what you said. Like, I didn't testify for the Democrats. I testified for the Republicans. Like, in what world does that happen to me?
And later in your book, you back end into your background, and I think you were born in Switzerland, and you grew up in America with a French mother and an American father. And I believe on one side, you're descended from slaves.
My father's side.
There are some scenes here that could be from the biographical backstory of many incredible activists. You're not exactly Tucker Carlson here. But what's interesting about your book is it's in equal measure a lecture. Lecture's the wrong word. It's an informative discourse aimed at progressives who deny the reality of sex. But it's also an informed discourse aimed at conservatives who deny the reality of gender dysphoria. The political reality you inhabit, being a professor at an elite university, you're not going to face any backlash for your lectures aimed at conservatives. That's completely uncontroversial. I mean, if you'd written an entire book that's just one diatribe about how awful Trump is, you just get nothing but golf claps from your peers. But you do get backlash from your progressive colleagues and students. You describe, and you don't really emphasize it, but you've been treated horribly by some people who have said terrible things about you. And you're going to have to explain this. I know what it means because I follow this nonsense, but you were accused of misogynoir. You seem an unlikely person to be accused of misogynoir. And I hope I'm not pronouncing it in an overly affected way, because the only people I see using that term are American activists, so I assume they pronounce it the way they pronounce like Baton Rouge or something like that. But can you explain how you, of all people, got accused of misogynoir, which is going to require that you first explain what misogynoir is?
So I realized when you were pronouncing it and then teasing about how it should be pronounced that I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right.
I'm from Quebec, so
well, I would say it the French way, which is misogynoir.
Oh, wow.
But that may not be right. But so it's misogyny as directed toward Black women.
Which is a thing.
Yes, of course. Hatred for, disregard for, denigration of women who are Black. I actually read about it researching for the book. I had not read before I was researching for the book that this had happened to me. I was looking up misogynoir and realized I found my name attached to a few instances of accusations of this. When I was writing about the Semenya case, and then when I was asked to testify in the case, I did a bunch of reading on her supporters, not necessarily people who were directly associated with her, but sort of allies around the world who were either using her case to push their agendas or...
This is a famous 800 meters is her main distance.
Yes.
Runner in the female category who, as is well known, had a disorder of sexual development, which essentially a male-bodied person who, for a variety of complex reasons and through no fault, if that's the right word, fault of her own, ended up in the female categories. She's from Africa and has been unwittingly thrust into the center of this debate about male-bodied participation in female sports categories.
Yeah, she's a multi-time world champion and Olympic gold medalist in the 800 meters, came out first in 2009 for the World Championships and had a decade of dominance on the international circuit in her event. And more importantly, for our purposes, became essentially the symbol of the question, what is a woman, before it was asked.
And a named party in sports litigation.
Right, exactly. Named party in sports litigation, where the question was, is what matters your legal, in her case, your legal identity or your actual sex, right? And she has what's called a 46XY DSD, which means she's a genetic male who was identified at birth as female and carries a female passport that says female, and so was entered into female competitions early on by the Federation in South Africa. She, at one point in that 10-year period, became an adult and owned her continued appearance in the category and continues to fight for her right to be there.
Under difficult circumstances and with great dignity.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, she's an extraordinary person. So one of the claims that was made by her allies, I don't know that she ever made it herself or her legal team or her PR team ever made it, so I don't want to attribute this claim at all to her, was that it was both racist and sexist to see her as anything but female. That if you understood that Black female bodies come in all different sizes, shapes, and colors, etc., you would not be so ignorant, racist, sexist. When I talked about making sure that the female podium at elite level, meaning, world championships, Olympic Games, the female podium at elite level featured female-bodied people, I was accused of misogynoir. And the idea was what I was resisting, apparently, or they thought that what I was resisting was Black female bodies on the podium, that I wanted only to see white female bodies on the podium. And, obviously, as I write in the book, they didn't know me, that they don't understand my background. And in any event, that wasn't what I was writing. I was writing that I wanted to see female bodies on the podium, not male bodies on the podium.
You're not going to say it, but I will say it. Based on your book, my understanding is that you're multiracial, you're half Black, and as I understand, you're married to a Black man with a long history in social activism.
Correct. So the 2 points I try to make in response to that claim and this is in chapter 1, are one, they don't know my background, but even if they did know my background, they shouldn't accuse me of it because, in fact, in track and field, most of these people don't know sport. And so they don't realize that almost all of the podium spots are taken by Black women, right? And that when we allow male-bodied athletes whose legal identity is female on the podium, they're displacing mostly Black women. And so if they knew those two things, they probably wouldn't have said that I was engaging in misogynoir.
The best example is the 2016 Olympics, where, if I remember correctly, all 3 podium spots in the 800-meter female category were occupied by caster, Semenya, at number 1 spot, gold medal. But the other 2 spots were occupied by other women who happened to be Black and who also happened to have the same disorder of sexual development as her.
Correct. All 3 athletes have 46 XY DSDs, which in effect means that of the 6 podium spots in the 800 meters in Rio, all 6 were occupied by male-bodied people.
On this podcast, we've had elite female rowers, we've had elite female swimmers, and one thing they often tell us, a lot of their training takes place in the company of men, and so sometimes it's right in front of their face, the performance differences between men and women. In general, when you're having these conversations, or when you're listening to activists like Chase Strangio, who is front and center with the ACLU on anything to do with trans stuff, do you often just say to yourself, this is a person saying things that no one who has ever done sports at anything above a recreational level would ever say if they had actually experienced competition?
Yeah, so I do. I have that reaction a lot. I don't know Chase personally, and so I don't know what he knows or not from either his own experience or from having researched the matter. He's litigating a lot of sports cases now, so maybe he knows more than he did a few years ago. But in general, I find that a lot of the language or analysis, and I'll put that in quotes, that the advocacy community uses in the sports space is uninformed and or intentionally misleading. When I read something from, for example, the Human Rights Campaign, do males have an advantage over females in sport? And then they conclude that they don't. I read that and I think either they don't know, and I get irritated because I think that if you are going to make an argument, you should learn the facts and make an argument from the facts, right? I feel like they're not doing their homework, or they know that people are relying on them and aren't going to do the homework themselves, and so they say things that they can get away with because most people are just going to hear them and adopt their positions.
So there are certain kind of lies you can tell in public but not in private.
Correct.
So for instance, you can get in front of a microphone in front of 1 million people and say, trans women are women, there are no biological differences between male and female, and everyone needs to get over their cis heteronormativity, and everyone will clap. But then if somebody comes up to that person and says, so you're really saying it's like totally cool for former NHL players who identify as women to play in the women's hockey league, they say, well, of course not. In private, they'll acknowledge that these things break down and don't make sense except as hashtags and slogans. Have you ever had that kind of conversation?
One of the things that I have been fortunate enough to experience is to have conversations with people across the political spectrum, including in the advocacy space. I'm assuming it's the same in lots of other political spaces where people have talking points or sound bites that they push out.
But this is science. So this is different from the red party is better than the blue party in all respects.
Right.
And then they privately admit, well, we're better in 80%. It's like saying COVID vaccines don't work for, some conspiracy theorists. And then when the mic's off, you say, actually, I've been vaccinated 4 times.
Yeah.
As an extra level of hypocrisy when it's about science.
The most obvious example I can give you of this phenomenon is the whole argument about whether testosterone is performance enhancing. Many of the advocates are willing to say things to the newspapers that are sort of sound bites and one-liners about how it's either not performance enhancing or male and female T levels overlap. They'll say things like that, right?
They'll show you the bell curves, the overlapping bell curves.
Yeah, which are not accurate scientifically. Among those public actors who testified in the Semenya hearing, when they got into the Semenya hearing, they were not willing anymore to say those things. They were in a room with their peers where the peer-reviewed evidence is really clearly to the contrary. And that was, so we were expecting a multi-day debate about the role of testosterone in human performance, and it actually lasted like an hour because all of the experts who had been quoted in the papers before the hearing who were willing to say those things to the newspapers were no longer willing to say them in a hearing. But I've had the experience also with advocates on the right and the left, right, who say things, I don't mean so much on the science, but just in general on these issues, right, who will say things in public because that's the public position that their group is taking, but have a much more nuanced conversation one-on-one, where weaknesses or nuance in the argument, the details of the argument are much more complicated, and they're willing to acknowledge that off the record, but not on the record. Yeah, it happens a lot.
So you're a triple threat, right? Because you're an elite athlete. I'm guessing you're still a very good athlete, though not headed for the Olympics. And you're obviously an elite legal academic. You're also a good writer. The book you've written is not like a law journal article. There's footnotes and stuff, but it's anyone who's interested in the issue can read it.
There are endnotes.
Okay, so there's endnotes because I always look to the endnotes first to look for my name. This is a highly informed book written for, I would say, a curious lay reader. However, some of the most memorable passages are, you can't make this stuff up, where you're quoting other people. And in this case, this is on page 31, you're quoting the Swiss-based Court of Arbitration for Sport, because one thing you learn when you get into this issue is there's this whole legal ecosystem of specialized tribunals that no one had ever heard of before regarding sport, but you've been doing this stuff for a long time. In the field of doping, which was very apolitical, and so that's another subplot. It just surprised you that suddenly you were thrust into a political sphere, because everybody hates doping, right?
Right.
So this is a quote from the CAS of the need to protect, quote, individuals whose bodies have developed in a certain way following puberty from having to compete against individuals who, by virtue of their bodies having developed a different way following puberty, possess certain physical traits that create such a significant performance advantage that fair competition between the two groups is not possible. Was there nobody at the CAS who just looked up and said, guys, this is ridiculous. Like, we can't write this. It sounds like Victorian writers trying to avoid the word vagina. There's something comically prudish about it, except the prudishness isn't based on avoidance of being sexually explicit. It's based on avoidance of saying a word that Kurt Strangio will dislike.
So there was nothing in the anti-doping work that we did that prepared me for this, because at that time, late 1980s through sort of the mid to late 1990s, everybody got that there was a male and female body and that androgens were a particular problem. Both males and females dope with androgens, but androgens have more of a performance enhancing effect in females than they do in males, because we have so little to start with that you could take a tiny bit and essentially double your circulating levels. Having said that, the one thing you didn't say when you read the passage was, the way I introduced that passage was to say, I hope it's okay if I read, in one of the most brilliant judicial passages I've ever read, Brilliant because of how it threads the needle between telling the truth about sex and dealing with the extraordinary politics of the situation. The cast wrote of the need to protect ...
Oh, I mean, it's brilliant in terms of CYA.
Yeah, but also you said before that Caster Semenya is an incredibly dignified human being. You know, she's complicated like everybody's complicated, but she's incredibly dignified. And she was in the room for the entire time, as we all were in the room for the entire time of the hearing, and also insisting throughout, as she does in her book, which is, you know, I recommend reading it because I think we can learn a lot from reading her book. Her memoir came out last fall. She believes she's a woman. And by her cultural standards, I think she's probably right. And in the face of that, all three of the arbitrators could accomplish what they needed to accomplish, or what they concluded they needed to accomplish after 5 days of testimony, right? Without insulting her. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Also, it's worth noting that I don't think it's something they do now, but there have been plenty of people who have been made to endure incredibly humiliating inspections of their secondary sex characteristics, what is properly called secondary sex characteristics, by doctors to ensure that, according to the standards of proof that then governed, that they were women.
Right. I mean, so look, if you're going to have sex classification, sex testing is necessary. The term sex testing has gotten a bad name, but in fact, it's necessary if you're going to have eligibility standards. The choice of how you do that is really important, and not doing unnecessarily invasive and humiliating tests is a really good idea for all kinds of reasons, right? Including the dignity and the privacy of the individual who would be tested. Testosterone is an incomplete proxy for sex, right? But one of the reasons it is still, I think, the best proxy, if you're not going to do chromosome testing, which would really be the best proxy, but testosterone is still the best proxy because it's so uninvasive.
It's a blood test.
Well, it's a blood test, but you're getting from a urinalysis, and the urinalysis comes from doping control. So it's not even initially an extra test, right?
It's the same technology that was used to see if you're on steroids or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And it has nothing to do with your genitals. So it's not a complete proxy in the sense that testosterone isn't sex. Sex is a whole body and integrated system. Testosterone is a bit of it, but it is a really good indicator, just like genitalia are a really good indicator at birth. Genitalia are a good proxy at birth, right, for what your actual sex is. So too is testosterone a good proxy from the point of puberty of whether a person is likely to be male or female. And so it drives male sexual development, and so drives the aspects of our bodies that make for more power, strength, and speed.
Is one unintended benefit of this whole controversy that it has caused feminist intellectuals such as yourself to sit back and say, let's look at the basic question: why are protections for sexed females important? And maybe go back to basics and do work that maybe you had taken for granted before?
Absolutely. And in fact, you wrote this great piece, and we had an exchange about it, I think, if I remember correctly. You wrote this great piece about a woman who was married to a person who came out as
Shannon Thrace.
Yeah, she had written a book, and you wrote a piece about her book. And one of the things that you said in that piece that struck me, and I realized when I read it that it was a great description of what I was doing, is you wrote that it's forced us. I don't remember. I mean, I'm going to be paraphrasing here. You probably remember better than I do, but it's forced us to articulate the reasons that sex matters, where we would have been stumped if you had asked us the question. And sometimes I still am, it's still so obvious to me in a really primal, precognitive way, if you will, that it matters, that when people ask me the question, sometimes I freeze, right? Because I'm wondering where this person is coming from, that they don't know too, right? And so what you captured was the point that in insisting, as it does, on sex blindness, the trans advocacy movement has forced us to articulate, and the way I put it in the introduction is a non-religious case that sex matters, right? Because there's an easy religious case that sex matters, an easy scientific or reproductive science explanation for why sex matters. But in terms of a personal and political argument, if you come from circles where I live in now, where we are lucky enough to be embedded in normative spaces where a lot of sexism is gone, right? We still see it periodically, but but it's mostly not present, glaringly present in our day-to-day lives.
It's heavily stigmatized.
It's heavily stigmatized, and we've controlled aspects of our biology through medications and things like that really were a lot like the men around us, and the men don't treat us differently anymore and all that. That's really a privileged moment in time and place and space, right? If you're outside of those settings, it so obviously matters, but the trans advocacy movement has sort of forced us to articulate this non-religious case that sex matters and how it matters. And if we care about them too, right? If we care about trans people too, we have to work hard, and we should work hard to find a way. And this is, this is where I write about being sex smart, not sex blind, sort of be smart about how we use sex, because it does matter. We need to use it, but smart about it in the sense that we're only using it for good things, and we're doing the least harm possible when we're using it. Beyonce talks about making lemonade, right? Out of lemons. I think we can make lemonade, or a lot of us have made lemonade out of this. I'm not sure everybody thinks it's sweet enough yet, but I'm
going to stop this metaphor right now because it's going to get out of control. Seeds and acidity and
yeah. Look, the argument for sex blindness has been there for a really long time. I talk about its etiology in the book. The trans advocacy movement didn't make it up. They picked it up and they're running with it. And so it's been there all along. We weren't in the position, or didn't need to at the time, make a good case, but I think we need to make one now.
I'm glad you brought up this phrase, sex smart. I don't know if it's going to catch on, but I like it. And you talk about a common sense approach, which to me is drawing sensible distinctions between recreational sport and highly competitive sport. To bring in the obligatory reference to disc golf, when I play in a recreational league and there's men and women together, no one cares. We're all having a good time. It's a non-contact sport. What I object to is that once money is involved and you're at professional level, and I've written about this, is that a professional male disc golfer can throw a disc 600 feet. Most women can't crack 450. So if there's money and trophies on the line, it makes absolutely no sense to let a male-bodied person into that space. And as a father of 3 girls, I have followed them longitudinally through many sports. And, a typical pattern is they will play in co-ed leagues. There's boys and girls, they're all having fun. And then around 10 or 11 or 12, there's this quantum leap where the boys don't just get faster and stronger, but they get more aggressive. They're faster on the puck. I remember in soccer in particular, she was then 10 years old. She loved soccer. I was around the age. Some of these guys were like muscling her off the ball, and she stopped enjoying it. That was when I started switching my kids to female-only leagues.
If you're going to have sex-segregated sport for kids, you need to understand why you're doing it, and it needs to be evidence-based. Your disc golf example is perfect, right? In a non-contact sport where it's recreational and everybody's having fun, then there's no reason really to talk about bodies that develop one way versus bodies that develop another way, right? But like you said, if there's money, if there are trophies on the line, but even earlier, like you're describing your kids, right, at 12, 13 years old, where they're already discouraged from continuing on. I don't mean your kids, but kids and girls in general start dropping out of same-sex sport around the onset of female puberty and as they're going through female puberty, because the body changes are so huge and there's so much going on in their lives that we want to do everything we can to encourage them to participate. And so at that point, there are good arguments for considering same-sex sport, even when it's recreational. I don't particularly subscribe to them, but I see the good arguments. I see that they're feasible.
You also get into the fact that in one of your chapters, how denying the existence of biological sex is arguably homophobic. Can you explain why you developed that argument?
The reality is that lots of kids who are, I like the term gender questioning in this period, are questioning their gender identity, questioning their sexual orientation. And people who are gay will tell you that that was their childhood. They mostly settled, not all of them, right? Some of them realized they were trans, but mostly they settled on the fact that they are gay. And they worry, and I think legitimately, that the cultural moment is to prefer trans people to gay people in terms of what is popular, what
gets the parade.
Also what's cared for,
right?
What's cared for. And so a kid who says, I'm confused, often the suggestion will be that maybe they're trans, and maybe they are, but also maybe they're gay. And so that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is, if being gay is defined as preferring sexually one, the male body or the female body, then if the male body doesn't exist or the female body doesn't exist, then neither does being gay. And for a movement that, and I'm talking about the trans advocacy movement now, for a movement that is based on respecting someone's self-identification, it comes off as really disrespectful, right? Because you have to respect the way I self-identify, but I'm going to tell you how you should identify.
I learned that you were in Budapest in 2022 on site when the world governing body regulating not just swimming, but other aquatic sports passed new rules which essentially enshrine the age-old biologically based standard, which, as I understand, if you went through a male puberty, at the highest levels, you're going to have to compete in male categories in swimming.
If you experienced any part of male puberty.
You can't put the genie back in the bottle by reducing your testosterone because
puberty affects through testosterone, but also on the female side, not through testosterone, right? The development of the male and female body, all of those effects together, they're morphological, they're physiological. They affect such changes in the two bodies that you can't have fair competition because there's an insurmountable performance gap between males as a group and females as a group as a result of the combination of things. Testosterone is the primary driver of the performance gap, but it's not the only driver. And so the idea is that underlying the World Aquatics rules, which have since been adopted by World Athletics, if you have experienced any part of male puberty, you are not eligible for the female category at elite level.
Does stuff like this mean that common sense is winning? Because this isn't the only sport. I think World Rugby has adopted common sense rules. Like, have we passed the point of peak strangio when it comes to like passing biology denying rules regarding female sport?
I mean, I think we're in a moment where courageous leaders of international sports federations are insisting on protecting the female category for female-bodied people. It's a highly political environment, and I don't think that for a minute, I don't think that the advocacy groups are done trying to push for change. As you and I speak, the European Court of Human Rights is going to hear the appeal in Castor Semenya's case. It's not going to be legally binding, whatever the result is, but it has a lot of influence when it says something is or isn't a violation of human rights. And so I think that we are in a moment where we're trending toward common sense, but this is not over.
Okay, let me ask you a more personal version of that same question. When you started speaking out on this issue, as you write in the book, there were some appalling incidents. There was one, I think you were speaking in a university and the campus left-wing club, I think it was like a Marxist club, like stormed into the proceedings and took pictures of everybody who was there and said, we're going to publicly shame you because you're here with these transphobes. And so people left the room and then they claimed, well, look, the room's empty, so no one wants to see these TERFs or whatnot. And there was an episode at your own university where I think student law journal members tried to shame you publicly. I get the sense that the environment has changed a little bit, where those kind of stunts don't work as much anymore, and where people are coming around to the fact that there's at least a legitimate debate here, which you're not going to successfully prosecute by trying to get people like you canceled. Do you find that there's a slightly friendlier environment for you at places like universities for the arguments you're making?
The environment is friendlier for me at Duke, but I've not traveled since then. Part of it was the first event you described was at UCLA Law, and that was right at the start of COVID. So part of it was that none of us traveled for a couple of years, right? And then I was writing the book, and so I didn't travel then. So I don't know how many female academics, including myself, would be welcome for a public talk at a university on these subjects right now. I definitely feel like the students have taken a turn in, for me, the right direction, in the sense that even if they disagree with me, they're willing to have a civil conversation, and they're interested and want to argue about it and all that, which I love, right? People don't have to agree with me, especially at a university, right? We're here to hear each other's ideas and arguments and to learn how to support them and all of that. So that feels like the student environment feels different. I'm just not sure about the broader environment. I've been really well supported at Duke in general by the administration. Again, not because I know that anyone agrees with my arguments one way or the other, but just because they believe in academic freedom and civil discourse, and they've done a really good job promoting that here.
Doriane Lambelet Coleman's new book is On Sex and Gender, A Commonsense Approach. Thanks so much for being on the Quillette podcast.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Quillette podcast. Quillette is where free thought lives. We are an independent grassroots platform for heterodox ideas and fearless commentary. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to Quillette.com and becoming a paid subscriber. This subscription will also give you access to all our articles and early access to Quillette social events.